Professor Neiman, welcome to the show.
Glad to be here.
A lot of people have seen the political spectrum in less of a direct line and more like a horseshoe. The further right you go, the further left you go, the ends are sort of meeting each other. Do you see that as true? Or
It's the most ridiculous thing in the world, frankly. The only way that you can have either a real relationship or real obligations towards people is if they come from your tribe. And the Enlightenment was against that, and all I'm against.
was social Darwinism or eugenics kind of a step back within the developing Enlightenment?
Very good question, yes. But they also think that we're basically only motivated by the power to pass on our genes and to create more copies of ourselves. And I think that's an absolutely ridiculous way to describe human behavior.
And I think what's really cool and unique about your critique of so-called woke ideology is that it's quite different from other people that I've seen. I've seen public intellectual figures like Ayaan Hirsi Ali. Her main critique came from its effect on merit or free speech, those kind of things.
I haven't read what Hirsi Ali has said recently, but the free speech argument is a bit ridiculous when MAGA is really the worst offender as far as free speech goes.
Professor Neiman, welcome to the show.
Glad to be here.
So, Professor Neiman was the former director of the Einstein Forum and is a philosopher who's dealt quite heavily with political philosophy as well as ethics and the legacy of the Enlightenment. And I guess it leads me to my first question, which is what really was the Enlightenment and what does it really mean to reason?
Those are two very big questions, so let me try to answer them. Both of them are very controversial. There are a lot of people who argue about what both of them are. I date the Enlightenment from 1698, when a book called The Historical and Critical Dictionary by Pierre Bayle was published and had a huge impact on people all over Europe. And I would end it at 1804, so it's just a little more than 100 years, with the death of Immanuel Kant. Okay, there are people who argue about exactly when and where. Some people want to date it as starting earlier, but I think that's a pretty good way to start. And the Enlightenment was, first of all, a movement against dogma. Okay, it was a movement insisting that people should be able to think for themselves and not be um uh have what they think, say, or read dictated by the church or the government, which was basically um you know are connected with the church. There is a wonderful novel which I will recommend by the writer Dan Kehlmann, Kehlmann. And the book is called Till, Tyll. It describes what life was like before the Enlightenment. And I think it's the best description or the best defense of the Enlightenment that anybody ever wrote. So, what you had were people who basically lived in a very circumscribed place, did not know much about the rest of the world, most of them couldn't read. And anybody who was curious about what the world was like, how anything from why, what happens to people after they're, uh, I mean, the church had some basic answers, okay? But anyone who questioned the church's answers, and this was basically one church, I mean, it was around the time of the Reformation, so you had arguments between churches, but anyone who questioned the church's description could be tortured and burned as a heretic, and that's one of the things that this novel describes so beautifully. How simple curiosity was seen as heresy. Okay, the Enlightenment was basically a movement that led to the great famous principles of liberty, equality, and fraternity as they were expressed in the French Revolution, and insisted that everyone in principle had the right to an education, the right to think for themselves, that torture should not be used as an instrument of, I mean, it was not only used as an instrument of punishment, it was used to get allegedly truth. Now, this is, and this is also something that Cameron's knowledge shows very well. Um, it was part of the judicial process was to torture the prisoner to get him to confess. Okay, so that was one of the first targets of the Enlightenment. um, the idea that people should be equal before the law, that it shouldn't be the case, for example, as it was, if a peasant whose family was starving stole a deer to feed his family, and the deer belonged to the lord, the duke or the baron or whatever it was, he could be hung. And that is something that happened very often. Okay. On the other hand, there was something called the right of the first night, which meant that if a young woman was a serf, belonged, as it were, to the feudal lord, um, the feudal lord could sleep with her. And that was just how it was. That is, people were defined and what they could do were defined by their status in a very hierarchical world. And the Enlightenment wanted to do away with that. Okay. Um, that's a short
Mhm.
um, definition of enlightenment. One could go on for a long time, but I think it's pretty fair to say that most of what we value in terms of modern medicine, in terms of basic democratic order, basic legal order, um, equality, at least in principle, that is, you do not have to do exactly what your parents did. You have the right to step, and we just assume that people, some people may choose to follow in their parents' profession, but it is not fixed by society, okay? That the baker's son has to be a baker and the miller's daughter has to be a miller's daughter, Mary Miller, and all of that. So all of those things that we take for granted, plus the idea of universal education, that everybody has a right to learn to read and write, and that that is part of becoming a good citizen in a democratic society. All of those things began in the 18th century with the Enlightenment. And the founding fathers of the United States were also influenced by the Enlightenment. Now, that lately has sometimes been used as a criticism of the Enlightenment, mm, because, as we know, the founding fathers declared that everybody has a right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness.
Mhm.
They left out Native Americans, they left out African Americans, and those are some pretty serious exceptions. Okay.
Mhm.
So there has been a trend in the last, mm, I would say, about 3 decades to dismiss the principles that the Enlightenment fought for, and to say that people like the founding fathers did not practice what they preached. That's certainly true of Thomas Jefferson, no question about it. And George Washington had said some, all of those things, and also wanted to remove Native Americans from what had been their ancestral lands. But the gray Enlightenment philosophers, and this includes Kant and Rousseau and Voltaire and Condorcet, so all of these people attacked slavery, attacked colonialism, Um, Kant has a passage where he congratulates China and Japan for not allowing the European invaders into their countries. Okay, so you, you have a sometimes a split between the principle and the realization of the principles, but those principles are the ones on which any democratic society is founded, and on which any criticism of racism or sexism or colonialism has to be based. That is, all of those criticisms are basically saying, wait a second, you said people should be free and equal. What about this group of people? What about that group of people? So that is the Enlightenment in a real. That's really a nutshell. People have written. I've got. I mean, I have libraries of books on the Enlightenment, but that's, I think, a pretty decent short definition.
Hmm. And I guess I wanted to touch on what you said earlier about it being sort of controversial that the founding fathers, although they had these ideals of freedom, which in large part stem from the Enlightenment, that they were inconsistent within their own behaviors. But I guess that's not to say that their ideas were wrong or that they were morally wrong just because they were inconsistent. Yeah.
Exactly. I mean, although I do think that that kind of inconsistency is morally
Oh,
wrong,
yeah, yeah.
Thomas Jefferson, say,
Hmm.
George Washington, but it doesn't mean that the ideas were wrong. It
Hmm.
means that people were slow in realizing them, and and again, the great philosophers of the Enlightenment were quite radical and quite consistent. And Kant is an interesting example because he starts out saying, quoting people saying some pretty racist things about Africans. Okay. So he starts out in his early life being fairly prejudiced, you would say, or racist. But by the time he thinks through the implications of his ideas, he's absolutely against slavery and against colonialism and very clear about that. It took him a while, and that's okay. I mean, I wish Thomas Jefferson had thought through and he did. There's a fabulous quote of his, which is kind of, uh, I don't know, it makes me shudder a little bit. He says, "I tremble for this country when I think that God is just." Because the suggestion is that the country is going to be punished for the injustice of slavery. And that's so in some part of himself, he knew that, but he kept his ownership of the slaves, the sheep. And that is, I think, a great moral failing. I don't want to let him off the hook for that.
Hmm.
Um, because I do think people, if they, propound certain ideas, all of us fall short of our ideals. That's where an ideal is, okay? But I think that, we're under an obligation to try as much as we possibly can to realize those ideals.
Hmm. Yeah, definitely. And with the Enlightenment, I think you've said that a very core value among the left should be universalism. Where exactly does that come from?
Oh, there are many people who think, although it comes from Christianity, actually,
Mhm.
okay, that we are, or I mean, and a little bit in Judaism, though not as much as in Christianity, we are made in God's image. So if we are all made in God's image, there is, there's almost something sacred, and certainly a sense of dignity in every single human being. And if you hurt another human being or despise or enslave another human being, um, in some religious traditions, you are, mishandling God himself. Okay. So that's an idea. That what the Enlightenment did, however, was to take away, you didn't need to believe in a particular religion. You simply had to believe that there are no principal differences between people um, uh, of different tribes. It was an age of exploration, and of course, there was also exploitation, but people were meeting, Europeans were meeting people from, different continents and different cultures. And the Enlightenment philosophers actually criticized Europe from the perspective of, other cultures. So, for example, they love to use Chinese culture to talk about how silly and superstitious Christians were. Okay, that was a trope. Voltaire's full of those kinds of remarks. Or Montesquieu's book, The Persians, talks about how much more rational Persian customs are than Europeans. So that is something that you once you have this basic idea that there isn't um, a deep distinction between human beings, which you can get from the idea that we're all equal in the eyes of God, and there's also a religious idea, but the Enlightenment, I think, went from that to saying, look, fundamentally, we're all equal. We grow up in different cultures. We have different capacities, but we all have something we're going to call human rights, the right to be treated with dignity.
Mhm.
Okay, and that is a big step towards progress from the idea that a duke and a peasant are fundamentally different people with fundamentally different rights, and they're defined by those rights. And it's not just that their place in society is defined by those rights, that's how they think of themselves. They do not think of themselves as, in any sense, being comparable. So, yeah, this is, and I argue it's a left liberal view that we are not defined by our tribal heritage or our tribal identity. We can have deep connections and therefore real obligations to people from absolutely anywhere.
Mhm.
And right wing, and you've got it in the US with MAGA, right, wants to claim that, America's a white Christian country, which, boy, oh boy, was not how the founders saw it. And that anybody who is not both white and Christian doesn't belong there. And the only way that you can have either a real relationship or real obligations towards people is if they come from your tribe.
Mhm.
And the light was against that. And all I'm against that. So
I guess this is just a short little fun question. And I guess you could answer it quite briefly. Was social Darwinism or eugenics, was that sort of, do you see that as a kind of a step back within the developing Enlightenment?
very good question. Yes. And that social Darwinism doesn't come to play until the late 19th century.
Mhm.
I think it's a huge step back. Now, Darwin is not responsible for social Darwinism.
Yeah.
Okay, there's a misreading of Darwin.
Mhm.
But yeah, and I talk about the evolutionary psychologists in leftist work who I think are responsible for a lot of damage, frankly,
Mhm.
because that's not. I mean, yeah, they're very tribalist. I mean, they think we only do things for our immediate relatives because that's passing on our genes. Um, but they also think that we're basically only motivated by the power to pass on our genes and to create more copies of ourselves. And I think that's an absolutely ridiculous way to spark human behavior.
Mhm. And I think, uh, for what it's worth, I'm sure Immanuel Kant would be agreeing with you in that regard because he was sort of the forerunner of this idea of libertarian free will, in which he sort of, yeah, I'm sorry.
And go on, go
Oh,
on.
I'm sorry. Yeah, he I guess he sort of tied freedom and free will with morality, and he said that our very kind of rational mechanisms and the faculty that we use to reason can get us to free will. And I guess my next question for you is, when we look at the state of the world with tribal politics and people identifying within their own, whether it be race, sex, etc., I'm wondering, does it sort of go back on his idea of free will, are they really does it sort of I guess downplay the rational mechanisms that we have in order to get to freedom?
Freedom is a choice for Kant,
Yeah.
okay? And we certainly can allow ourselves to simply be carried along by the environments around us. If we don't think for ourselves or stand up for ourselves, it's a choice, okay? Um, and, in the same way that progress is a choice too, it's not something that's inevitable. It depends on us.
Mhm.
So yeah, I definitely think that the move towards tribalism is a huge step backwards, and that's why I wrote that book, because that used to be a right wing thing. I mean, it used to be the MAGA, everybody out except my tribe, used to be on the right. I have been disturbed by liberal leftists. Um, So, what really disturbed me and what made me write Left is Not Woke was the fact that a lot of people on the left were increasingly becoming tribal.
Mhm.
And, um, that's, uh, um, just, well, it's against the ideals of the Enlightenment, but and the ideas of liberal leftist thinking, but it's just also the last bloody thing we need this moment in time. I just finished reading a wonderful book by an Israeli friend of mine who's been a very strong activist for peace and justice for many years. And he asked me to read his manuscript and write an endorsement. And he ends with a story of his own mother lived grew up was born, grew up in a village, Hebron, which is on the West Bank. And there was a massacre in 1929 of um, the Arabs were massacring the Jews in that village. And her family was saved because their Arab landlord stood indoor and said, "You will not take this family." And some people were slashing at him, slashed his leg open. And he just said, "You will not take these people." And that's for my friend Avram, that's a kind of foundation for a hope for a humanistic, um, hope for peace and justice. And that happens sometimes, this, refusal of tribalism to just simply stand up for other human beings.
Mhm. And I think what's really cool and unique about your critique of so-called woke ideology is that it's quite different from other people that I've seen. I've seen public intellectual figures like Ayan Hirsi Ali, who her main critique came from, I guess, other reasons, which weren't that they abandoned left ideals. It's more like its effect on merit or free speech, those kind of things. And for what it's worth, I'm not sure if you endorse her critique at all. But I think it's very unique, your perspective. Uh,
It is. Most people have criticized the work, have done it from the right, and a lot of my friends worried that, I would be helping the right if I read that book. I haven't read what Hirsi Ali has said recently, but the free speech argument is a bit ridiculous when MAGA is really the worst offender as far as free speech goes. I mean, banning Martin Luther King or Toni Morrison from public libraries and trying to deport people if they're not citizens. I mean, cancel culture is a very old phenomenon. It goes back at least in the West to Plato. Okay, Plato, who in many ways was a great philosopher, I agree, wanted to cancel Homer. Okay,
mhm,
um, everybody's talking about the Odyssey now. I don't think it's a very good movie, but it's a great book. Um, but he thought it would be a bad influence on the youth to um, to listen to Homer. So cancel culture has a very old history. It's not the property of one um, political standpoint or another. And there was a lot of noise about the work being canceling things. That's a very short-sighted um, uh, way of looking at things. I'm not in favor of cancel culture, but it's certainly not unique to progressives or to conservatives. It's a tool. It's not what I was criticizing about the woke, which is different.
Yeah, it's almost like people are creating a binary between different political parties in which they put in ideals and they sort of hoard it as it's their own within different sides. And I do wonder if that's causing a greater divide or if it's causing more polarization within different countries. Um, this is sort of a random question, but a lot of people have seen the political spectrum in less of a direct line and more like a horseshoe, which I thought was quite interesting. They see it as where the further right you go and the further left you go, the ends are sort of meeting each other. Do you see that as true or?
It's the most ridiculous thing in the world, frankly. That somehow this horseshoe, like I say in my next book, I have a book coming out in September. Horseshoe is a metaphor. It's not a theory. There's
Ah,
zero
I see.
evidence
Yeah.
for that metaphor.
Mhm.
And it's a very shallow way of looking at things. I mean, here's an example. There are some people who call, I also think the word populist has no content, has no meaning.
Mhm.
And when you ask people to define it, they have a very hard time um, saying anything except, oh, I like a sort of middle. So people have called, as soon as people started calling Bernie Sanders a left populist and Donald Trump a right populist. I said this word has no meaning.
Mhm.
Okay, um, Bernie Sanders has policies. He has criticisms. They're fairly simple, and he's had them for a long time. Okay, um, Donald Trump has very few genuine policies at all. He likes riling people up, with certain slogans against foreigners, say, or now against communists. I don't know if there are any communists in the United States anymore, but there's socialists, and I'm certainly one of them. But um, uh, he doesn't. I mean, there's no content to the program, okay?
Mhm.
Except, as we've seen, unfortunately, his enriching himself and his family more than any president in the history of the republic. He doesn't even have a clear foreign policy. I mean, many people elected him because he was not, and as he promised not to start any wars, and here we are.
Mhm.
So, it just to say this is a horseshoe because both of them speak rather loudly. I mean, there are other examples, obviously, that people try and point out with this horseshoe metaphor, but it's a useless metaphor, and I think it should be dropped.
And another thing, I think you said something about words like populist being meaningless. I do find it that people don't really know how to define themselves politically because they don't know what the terms mean, whether it be conservative, liberal, libertarian, classical liberal. Do you find that to be an issue at all, where people don't really get their own name of the party or name of their social or political affiliation?
Well, totally, and that is why I wrote this. But the interest in writing that last book was to define what left is,
Hmm.
and I came up with some pretty straightforward statements that I think, well, three of them apply to leftists and liberals. One is um, universalism versus tribalism. One is that you believe there's a difference between justice and power. We may not always see the difference. There are plenty of lying politicians who would tell us they're doing something because it's just or because it's right, and actually they're only interested in their own power. But in principle, if you're a leftist or a liberal, you want politics to be about justice. You don't give up on the idea of justice simply because you know that it's been instrumentalized. And thirdly, you believe that progress is possible, not necessary, but possible. Okay, so those are the three things that liberals and leftists have in common. I know leftist sounds like a scary word in the United States of America, but it's not in the rest of the world. It's a perfectly legitimate political position. And the difference between leftists and liberals is that leftists believe that we have social rights, a right to healthcare, a right to education, a right to housing, a right to partake in culture, and a right to fair working conditions. And that those rights are as important as political rights to speak or worship or travel. Now, all those things are written into the UN Declaration of Human Rights, which will, um, agreed on in 1948. Franklin Delano Roosevelt had actually written a new Bill of Rights, okay, in which he included social rights. But if you bring that up in the United States these days, you're accused of being a communist or at least a socialist, and this all seems very foreign. But I assure you that if you live in most other countries, um, they think of the United States as absolutely barbaric. And I am not talking about wealthy northern Scandinavian countries. I'm talking about places like Brazil, where all healthcare is free for everybody,
Mhm.
for example. Okay. You just look at the way we do things as barbaric.
Mhm.
Um, so um, yeah, so I have tried to give simple and clear definition of what it means to be left and what it means to be liberal.
And I guess a quick example of words changing their meaning when it comes to politics is, I think you said in the book, the word socialism. People are afraid of that word, whereas earlier it used to be called quite a legitimate stance on economics and politics, whereas nowadays people are quite scared of what it really means. I guess it's a little bit different now in upcoming years as different politicians, AOC, etc., have been outspoken democratic socialists. So I guess I can see it sort of changing nowadays. Um, yeah.
Happily,
Mhm.
I just heard an interview with Zara Mamdani in which he said, you know, if I would propose today to form an institution in which people could borrow books for free, they would call me a crazy communist. That's our library system, you
Mhm.
know? I mean, y- you know, we do, thanks to left leaning politicians and activists in US history, we do have elements of social rights that are built in and take for granted. You
Mhm.
know, in the 20s, the right was arguing that laws against child labor were socialist and would restrict our freedom.
Mhm.
Okay? They were furious about the idea that, you know, 6-year-olds should not be allowed to work, for example. And it was, in fact, impossible to get that law passed. FDR went around it by um, by insisting on schooling, on public necessary public schooling. So, but you couldn't ban child labor because this was seen as a communist position.
Mhm. And I guess, yeah, that I could definitely see where you're coming from that perspective. And to wrap it up, because I know you got to go, my last question is about victimhood, because you specifically wrote in your book that recognizing, not just the victors but also the vanquished is a genuine sign of moral progress. But I wanted to sort of ask, how do we distinguish between people who are genuinely victims and people who like to claim it so they can have the benefits of victimhood, or for whatever reason that they might be putting themselves in that position?
So a great question. Um, and I am writing, well, I have another book coming out that's completely different, but when that's out, I've been working for a long time on a book on, it's called Heroism for an Age of Victimhood.
Mm-hmm.
And so I've been thinking a lot about this stuff. Problem with your question is that you're asking, many people want philosophers to provide, which is a necessary and sufficient um, set of criteria so that you could pick out this person is a real victim, this
Yeah.
person, thank you, yeah? And those are the hard questions that absolutely depend on judgment, okay?
Mm-hmm.
And looking at every particular case. I mean, the same thing, by the way, goes for heroes, okay? Who's a real hero and who's faking it? I mean, is also something that you need to look into each particular case very carefully, okay?
Mm-hmm.
Now, when I said I think it was historical progress, um, I think it was. If you go back to the time, let's say, of the Middle Ages, the idea that thousands of people would die in wars or be tortured to death
Mm-hmm.
was just okay. That's the way the world is, you know. Colonialism, okay, which in many places did not realize the basic humanity of, I mean, if you read anything about what the early Spanish conquistadors did in South America, it's stomach turning, the slaughter and torture that they did of Native Americans they did not count as human. Now, actually, it was the church, interestingly enough, that at least put a partial stop to that in the name of one brave, important priest and thinker, Bartolomeo de las Casas, who said, hey, these are people you cannot, this is, these are also children of God, and we cannot do that. But that was a revelation to people. That was the somehow being able to suppress the humanity of people and slaughter them or enslave them,
Mm-hmm.
um, and to forget about them and to often not give them names, or to give them new names if they were enslaved, but not to remember. Um, I think it's a good thing
Yeah.
that we do remember the victims and that we write history not simply from the perspective of the victors. But I think something changed significantly about the middle of the 20th century where we sort of overcorrected for the victim's perspective, and um, that became the subject of history.
Mm-hmm.
And, so I think your question is a very good one, but I think you're asking for something that nobody can give.
Yeah.
It's just, we'd all love to have it. I mean, I'd love to be able to say to certain people, you are not a victim. Go look at, somebody who grew up in a Syrian refugee camp,
Mm-hmm.
or in South Sudan, and then, you know, talk about your trauma, please.
Mm-hmm. I see. Yeah. Definitely.
Um, but uh, you it's not something that you can give a blanket answer to.
Mm-hmm. I see. Definitely. Um, and I guess when you say that recognizing victims are is genuine moral progress, I can see why it becomes a little bit difficult for some people who will say like, well, when we look at World War II and the United States bombing Japan or whatnot, but then I think about it more and more, and then I see that there's, these horrors that happen with war, and it's not just one sided. There's a double side to every story. There's people who win and people who lose on both sides of any conflict. So I think that recognizing that as genuine moral progress, but also having a sort of sense of judgment can be very, very good.
Yeah. Well, it's necessary if you're going to make any kind of moral decisions. Yeah.
Mhm.
Get it.
I see. And I guess that would be my concluding question. Thank you so much for coming on, and I wish you the best.
Pleasure to meet you, and I hope you go on thinking about these questions.